Buenas tardes, John. Gracias por dejarte entrevistar una vez más. Empecemos por el final. Primera pregunta. Diciembre de 2022. ¿Qué significa esta fecha para ti? ¿Es un momento esperado o más bien un momento temido? ¿Y por qué?
Well, I'd say that if SCIC were a hellhole, it would be an eagerly awaited moment. But SCIC isn't a hellhole, and so I'd say that I'm neither eagerly awaiting it nor am I dreading it. I've often talked to my contemporaries about retirement in recent months, and there are three things that they sometimes fear. One is that, of course, retirement is a reminder of advancing age. Secondly, they fear a lack of structure in their lives, and thirdly, that they're worried that they will lose some status, that people won't take them so seriously anymore. Now, I can understand all these misgivings, but I'm looking forward to my retirement. I want to spend more time with my family. Now, in British politics, that is often what disgraced ministers say once they've been involved in a sex scandal and they have to resign. But in my case, it's a genuine wish to spend more time with my family, my aged parents, my grandson who's 1 year old. And life is full of opportunities, climbing mountains, drinking wine, travelling, etc. And I may do a spot of teaching in a Central European university from time to time, and that should keep me off the streets, I reckon.
Segunda pregunta. Empezaste a trabajar hace 42 años. ¿Has visto la evolución de la profesión desde sus inicios, podríamos decir, sin llegar a Nuremberg, por supuesto? Haznos un repaso histórico profesional, digamos, desde tus inicios hasta la actualidad.
Well, I'm glad you don't think that I was at Nuremberg. I in fact worked once with a colleague who'd interpreted the Nuremberg trials, and it was very impressive listening to what she had to say. And she was also a very impressive interpreter. I'd say that there are two major evolutions. One is greater professionalism. When I look back, I often think to myself how amateurish we were in the 1980s, because we had very few documents in advance. For example, we had to go to a cupboard in a particular building and get hold of documents which weren't always there. Today we have all sorts of electronic documents, lots of different language versions, so we're far more professional than we were then. And another example of greater professionalism is that today interpreters have all been trained. Whereas when I started, there were people who'd never been trained, who simply picked up languages by knocking around Europe, and some of them were very talented, some were, shall we say, mediocre. If I could just add one point. I mean, so there's been a shift towards greater professionalism, but also a striking development is, of course, the increased number of languages, multilingualism. When I started, there were 6 languages. Now there are 23 or 24 in the European institutions. And that's been a major change, and it's been a remarkably successful change, because we've managed to find and recruit a lot of interpreters in languages where there was no tradition of interpreting. It's quite an achievement. Of course, this multilingualism is to some extent a facade behind which English continues to be more and more dominant. And so the question is, to what extent will multilingualism remain a genuine factor. But I'd say those are the two major changes I've seen. I'm talking, of course, about the period up to COVID. What happened during and after COVID is a different chapter.
Tercera pregunta. Cuando los jóvenes entran en la profesión, siempre se les dice que la edad de oro de esta profesión ya ha pasado. Para ti, ¿cuándo ha sido la edad de oro de la profesión?
Well, I think golden ages, by definition, are always in the past. And I could not tell you exactly when the golden age of interpreting was. It's I can understand why some people feel that the golden age is behind us. There are two reasons, I think. One is that interpreting used to be much more central. In the 1980s, up to about 1995, there was a sort of level pegging between English and French as the dominant language in the European institutions. And you could not have run a meeting only in English at the time. Whereas today, we often get the impression that we're there for political reasons, but the meeting could actually take place without us. So interpreting is less central. A second phenomenon is that there are now so many of us. If you have a 23 meeting, that means there are 69 interpreters, whereas in the old days, in the 1980s, we were a much more select band, and so we tended to accompany delegates on various trips because it was physically possible. Today, it's become so unwieldy. So in those two respects, I can understand why some colleagues feel that the golden age is behind us. But as regards professionalism and the tools we have at our disposal, I'd say the golden age is now.
Cuarta pregunta. Volvemos a lo que tú has dicho del multilingüismo. ¿Crees que está muriendo el multilingüismo con esa importancia creciente del inglés? ¿Lo crees?
Yes, it's difficult to say. I don't think that multilingualism will die because language is so closely bound up with national identity. Now, what I'm saying depends very much on the country. I don't think that the Danes, for example, are deeply attached to the use of their language in Brussels. One gets the impression that in Brussels, Danish is a moribund language. But there is this link, and at a certain political level, it's important to use the national language. Secondly, if the European institutions are to be close to citizens, they have to speak their language. You can't organise some event in Slovakia without having Slovak as a working language. And thirdly, if money is at stake in an audit, for example, people will want to use their language to be on safer ground. If I were having my finances audited by people from Brussels, I wouldn't want to speak a foreign language to convince them that I hadn't done anything irregular. So I think there are reasons why multilingualism will not die. However, English will probably become more and more dominant. And today, it's always embarrassing for an educated person not to speak English. And I remember the Czech finance minister the other day broke into Czech during the ECOFIN meeting and apologized. Because he couldn't find the right words in English. His English was rather halting, so he could read a text, but he couldn't really speak spontaneously. And he apologized, whereas it's his native language, and Czech has the same status as any other language.
Quinta pregunta. Tengo entendido que no eres un gran fan de la tecnología. ¿Crees que la tecnología nos está complicando la vida? ¿Cómo ves la importancia que está adquiriendo la tecnología en nuestra profesión?
obviously you've heard these malicious rumours about my parlous digital skills. What can I say? I'll make a general point first about technology, because I think it's often overlooked. Technology is something which is inevitable. Technological development will take place whether we like it or not. And once something has been invented, it can't be disinvented. You can't go around, or you shouldn't go around smashing machinery like the Luddites in the Industrial Revolution. Secondly, I think we have to shape technology and tame it, humanize it. That's very important. One cannot afford to be a technophobe. And thirdly, technology doesn't, or technological development doesn't replace everything which came before. Books haven't become obsolete. So I think we shouldn't overrate the extent to which technology will transform and alienate everything we know in our lives. Those are general comments. I'd add a specific comment about how technology has helped us enormously rather than complicating our life. In the old days, when you arrived in the booth, if you didn't know something in the morning, you didn't know it in the afternoon, because you couldn't look it up very easily unless you had lots of dictionaries, encyclopedias, or very knowledgeable colleagues. Today, I can use my smartphone in the booth and check all sorts of facts. Now, of course, the facts in themselves don't mean very much unless you know the context, unless you have general knowledge. But this access to knowledge is something which has made our work far more professional. So technology has been an ally. Now, we have to consider, of course, the impact of platforms, but no doubt you will come to that later.
Exactamente. ¿Qué hacemos con la RCI?
Well, I'd say there's both a human and a technical side. I'll begin with the human side. I'm convinced that the vast majority of delegates, the vast majority of interpreters prefer in-person meetings, because a lot is lost if you see someone just on a screen, the body language, etc., and opportunities for networking don't exist. So there is this inbuilt preference for in-person meetings. On the other hand, I can fully understand the many arguments in favour of remote interpreting, because why are we going to travel across Europe for just an hour or two? It's a waste of time, it's a waste of energy at a time when we want to save our planet, and it's an efficient use of resources. So I can understand the arguments, but I think because of this inbuilt preference for in-person meetings, I don't think that most meetings will become remote in future, or I think that delegates will want to be there in person mainly. So that's the human side. The technical side, now there are a lot of self-appointed experts on sound, and they indulge us with their wisdom. I shall not try to compete with them. I am no expert on sound. All I'd say is that the proportion of remote meetings shouldn't be too great, otherwise it becomes very alienating. That's what I fear most of all. And I'm not too pessimistic about that.
Séptima pregunta. ¿Por qué te hiciste intérprete? ¿Y te harías intérprete hoy?
So, it's a long time ago that I took that decision. I could very well have done something different. I came to Brussels to train as an interpreter because the Commission ran a training course and I was offered a maintenance grant, and I would know after 6 months whether I'd make it or not. So I thought, well, it's worth trying. But I might very easily have accepted a job offer in the civil service or in the Bank of England. So I think if there hadn't been this training course, I probably would never have come to Brussels. So I became an interpreter almost by chance, but I've always loved languages, and I've always been interested in public affairs. So this is a profession which I always considered. Natural curiosity will make one want to try something different, but I have no regrets. I have absolutely no regrets about the way I've spent the last 42 years. So I don't know how to answer your question, but no regrets, yet I feel that I could have done something different.
Octava pregunta. Este es un buen momento para dejar la profesión, ¿no? Terminar. ¿Qué te parece?
Is it a good time to leave the profession? Well, it's hard to say. On the one hand, demand has recovered. There's a shortage of English language interpreters. So if anyone is listening out there who would like to consider a career as an English speaking interpreter, this is your chance. On the other hand, it depends very much on what kind of future we have. If the future is mainly soft consoles and working remotely, then I think it's a good time to leave the profession. But I cling to the belief that overwhelmingly there's a preference for in-person meetings. We'll see.
We'll see. Novena pregunta. Se ha ido toda una generación de intérpretes brillantes que colaboraban mucho con mi blog. Pero también llegan nuevas generaciones. ¿Qué características crees que debe tener un intérprete que empieza hoy para tener una carrera larga y brillante? ¿Qué características tiene que tener?
I think that's something which hasn't changed. What's always been fundamental and what will always be fundamental is the ability to analyze and to communicate on the basis of good general knowledge and on the basis also of curiosity, a willingness and an ability to engage in lifelong learning. That was true in 1981 when I started. It's true today. Now, of course, an interpreter today has to be capable of using all the tools we have. But I don't regard that as being as big a challenge as learning to interpret.
Décima pregunta. Como es la décima, la última pregunta, y que es la última vez que yo te voy a entrevistar a ti, te haré una pregunta abierta para que tú decidas qué quieres contestar. ¿Cómo quieres despedirte? ¿Cómo te gustaría que te recordaran? Contéstame a lo que tú quieras, porque es la última pregunta que te hago en nuestra colaboración conjunta.
Well, I think it's rather presumptuous to leave a message, some kind of testament. I'm a modest man with a lot to be modest about. But if you insist on a message, I'd say we have to be of good heart, because we've been through such difficult times recently. When the COVID pandemic broke out, the risk was that interpreting would become totally irrelevant. And we managed to remain relevant. It was very difficult, but demand today has recovered, and I think that we're still in reasonably good shape despite everything. So I think we can be proud of ourselves, and we should not fear the future. However, we need to shape that future, and we need to do so realistically, but clinging to what makes this a great profession. We have to uphold our ethics, and we have to maintain the highest possible standards. And how would I like to be remembered? Well, epitaphs are normally to be found on tombstones, and I think that's rather premature. But I'd like to be remembered as a good colleague, a decent chap, to use rather old-fashioned terminology, but above all, perhaps someone who tried at least to maintain high professional standards in the booth, in the classroom, and who also tried to be a loyal, commissioned civil servant. If you're an employee of an organisation and an interpreter at the same time, there may sometimes be a tension between the two. Sometimes you may be more attached to your status as a civil servant or to your profession, but I think that the two have to be reconciled, and I hope that I've managed to do that to some extent at least.
Muy bien. Muchas gracias, John, por tantas entrevistas a lo largo de los años. Disfruta de esta nueva etapa de tu vida y espero que nos volvamos a ver. Gracias.
Well, thank you very much.